So chapter 10 talks about land, public and private. So we're going to look at national parks, we're going to look at forests, and we're going to look at urban areas. So your book opens with the case study of Julia Butterfly Hill. And Julia Butterfly Hill, Pacific Lumber Company, which was a leader in environmental stewardship in terms of harvesting trees, did selective cutting versus clear cutting. We'll get into that in more detail. In 1986, Pacific Lumber bought and was renamed Maxim, and they had different people that were in charge of how they ran their business. They were clear cutting a lot of old growth forest and redwood trees, and so Julia Butterfly Hill sat in Luna, that's the name of her redwood tree, for 2 years, 1997 through 1999, to protest Maxim's clear cutting logging practices. As a result, Luna and 7,500 acres was protected, and Julia's actions caused the company millions of dollars, and they ended up filing bankruptcy. The important questions that this raises is, do citizens of the U.S. have the right to influence what activities occur on private or public lands? And do you think Julia Hill was a hero or a villain? She sat and protested for 2 years, which prohibited this company from making money. It's an interesting dynamic to analyze. So human land affects the environment in many ways. Using land benefits humans, there's negative consequences. People don't always agree on land use and management priorities. And the three main concepts that we're going to look at initially are tragedy of the commons, which we're familiar with, externalities, and maximum sustainable yield. As a quick review, the tragedy of the commons, this is Garrett Hardin. It's the tendency of a shared limited resource to become depleted because people act from self-interest for short-term gain. The commons that your book lists, that I want you to be familiar with, land. Land is a commons in terms of agriculture and grazing. Air is a commons. Who owns it? And more importantly, who's responsible if it's polluted? And then water is a commons. Who has access to it? Who can use it? And fisheries, harvesting fish. This is our illustration of the commons. If we just have our three little sheep on there, they have plenty of grass. One or more users increases their use because they stand to benefit from it. What happens when we overuse that common area, and then now nobody essentially benefits? An externality is the cost or benefit of a good or service that is not included in the purchase price of that good or service. The analogy that your book gives talks about a bakery. So you can have both positive externalities and negative externalities. So if a bakery comes into your town, or right next to your house, I guess, the positive externality is that you get to smell fresh bread. Maybe you wake up to the smell of fresh bread every morning, and that's a great way to wake up. And that's just an added benefit of that bakery going in by your house. And negative externality might be that in order to make that fresh bread, the employees come in at 3 or 4 in the morning, and the noise of them working wakes you up. And so that would be a negative externality. The concern with the environment is the negative externalities. Things like overgrazing. How do we have this land that can be used, but we don't want to overuse it. And how do we manage that? One of the things to prevent tragedy of the commons is private ownership. If we have people own it, then they will be responsible for it. Or regulation by local and federal governments by putting in those permits, like we spoke about earlier this year, hunting permits or fishing permits. Maximum sustainable yield is another concept. It's the maximum amount that can be harvested without compromising the future availability of that resource. So the maximum harvest that can be replaced by the population growth. This is usually at a maximum rate when it's at approximately half the carrying capacity. And since we just did population growth, you have this idea of this S-shaped curve. Maximum sustainable yield keeps the population half the carrying capacity, but in reality, it's really hard to calculate the maximum sustainable yield. How many deer can we harvest from an area that's not going to deplete the reproductive ability of those deer, but then also not to allow the deer to become so populated that they're overgrazing that area? What happens if some sort of blight comes through and kills many more deer than we anticipated? There's all sorts of things that factor into it. So it is a difficult idea to calculate. It's good in concept, but difficult to execute. Now looking at land use, we have a nice map here that shows protected areas, both internationally, nationally, and then under both jurisdictions. And you can see how much land is truly protected. The 6 international categories of public lands are national parks, which are managed for scientific, educational, and recreational use, sometimes for beauty. Managed resource protected areas for the sustained use of biological, mineral, and recreational resources. Habitat, species, and management areas, actively managed to maintain biological communities. Strict nature reserves and wilderness areas, which are established to protect species and ecosystems. Protected landscapes and seascapes, which are non-destructive use of natural resources while allowing for tourism and recreation. And national monuments, protect unique sites of special natural or cultural interests. These are our 6 categories of public lands. Looking at the United States, what percentage of the land in the U.S. is publicly held? It's 42% of our land is publicly held. It's larger than any other nation. The highest percentage of that land is out on the West Coast. You can see that 55% of our land that's publicly held is in the western continental states, and you can see that all here, this bulk of this here. And an additional 37% of the land that we hold is in Alaska. Very, very little on the East Coast. And then the public lands in the U.S. Include rangelands, national forests, national parks, national wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas. So resource conservation ethic, this is the idea that people should maximize resources based on the greatest good for everyone. We have federal lands that are managed by 4 main areas. One is the Bureau of Land Management. The abbreviation is BLM, and you need to be familiar with some of these abbreviations because they get used pretty frequently. And the Bureau of Land Management is responsible for grazing, mining, timber harvesting, and recreation. The U.S. Forest Service, USFS, is responsible for timber harvesting, grazing, and also recreation. The National Park Service, NPS, deals primarily with recreation and conservation. And then Fish and Wildlife Service, FWS, deals with wildlife conservation, hunting, and recreation. And they manage 95% of our federal land, those 4 organizations. So they're ones that we want to sort of be familiar with and know when we hear those acronyms. We want to be able to know that USFS is forests, and we want to know that FWS is fish and wildlife. Rangelands are dry, open grasslands, typically things that we think of for cattle grazing. It's the most common use land in the United States. The problem with rangelands, well, there's problems and benefits. One is that it's semi-arid, so it's great for grazing and not so great for agriculture. So we get that benefit of using them for cattle grazing. But also means that it's susceptible to fires and also environmental disturbances. It's managed by the Bureau of Land Management, so BLM. Grazing is a better way for us to feed our cattle than feedlots, but overgrazing can cause things such as water pollution and erosion. You can see some images of that down in the lower right there. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 was to make it so that the rangelands were no longer commons. They made it permit-based so that you had to buy a permit to have so many cattle graze on common lands. But the problem is that the permits are so inexpensive that there's still plenty of overgrazing. It's easier to just buy permits and then allow your cattle to overgraze. The Bureau of Land Management looks to minimize grazing damage, but in their policies, there's no environmental scientists involved. So they don't have any environmental scientists putting any input into what they're doing. Forests are areas dominated by trees, other woody vegetation. We're familiar with forests. There's more money spent on managing the timber program and building and maintaining roads than received from the royalties. So you can harvest from national forests. So 73% of forest timber areas are privately owned, but you can still harvest from national forests, but you need to pay a royalty for that. But the royalties do not offset the cost of the roads and other things that happen. Logging roads, the problems you fragment that habitat. There's a decline in forest biodiversity. You're compacting the soil, so therefore there's nutrient loss, reduction in water that's allowed to percolate through. The two main timber harvest practices are clear cutting and selective cutting. In clear cutting, you remove all the trees within an area. It's by far the most economical. You reseed, so you replant that area, but often it's reseeded as a monoculture. You need something that can grow quickly and can grow with a lot of sunlight. You're not having a lot of shade from mature trees. And it's a big decrease in biodiversity. It allows for a huge increase in wind and water erosion. So we have that loss of soil that's going to run down the banks while we have all those young trees that aren't able to hold it in. They don't have the root structure to do that. That sediment is going to make its way into streams. Also, because there's less sunlight, there's going to be more sun headed to the streams, which is going to increase the temperature of the streams and many impacts down the road. We also have selective cutting. It removes single trees, but can only replant shade trees, say shade-tolerant trees. There's less impact, but you still need to get the roads in and the equipment in to deal with that. And here's the images that you have of clear cutting versus selective cutting. The third way is an ecologically sustainable forestry. You're removing trees without compromising biodiversity, or trying not to compromise biodiversity. Instead of using machinery, you're using horses to help remove some of those trees, which don't need the established roads that equipment would need. But in theory, all logging disrupts habitat, and this is an expensive way to do that. When you have a tree plantation, such as you would after clear cutting, you have a large area of single rapidly growing tree species. So you never have that mature diverse forest. You're going to deplete the soil. If some sort of blight were to come in, it will move rapidly through that whole area. 30% of commercial timber in the world is produced in the U.S. and Canada, so that's noteworthy to know that North America is producing a large quantity of commercial timber. It disrupts the habitat. It replaces complex forest ecosystems with tree plantations, like I just mentioned, and biodiversity protection regulations are not specifics. The USFS, the Forestry Service, can say, peak critics can claim that they're not protecting the biodiversity, but they maintain that they're doing the best that they can. How do you establish what that gauge is of managing biodiversity? Fire management. Fires are important ways to manage forests. We used to stop all forest fires, and now we do allow some controlled burn, and sometimes we even set forest fires because it's needed. What it does is it releases nutrients in the dead biomass back into the soil. So if we're forever stopping those fires, we're not allowing them to happen. The most famous one is the Yellowstone fire. You can see the huge percentage of Yellowstone that was burned in 1988. Your book claims that people may not even recognize that Yellowstone had such a big fire, but I was there 10 years ago, and you can still see the impacts of that fire. On the other hand, it allowed some elk and many other biodiversity to increase in that area as that forest regrows. National parks are established to preserve scenic views and unusual landforms. They're managed for scientific, educational, aesthetic, and recreational use. They're specifically to protect ecosystems, conservation, protection of wildlife species, and their habitats. Seeing different national parks is one of the greatest things that I've been a part of being able to see. If you have the opportunity to visit any national park, I promise you won't be disappointed. The primary challenge is that we want to still reduce the impact of human activities both in and out of the park. So we're protecting this park, these scenic views. On the other hand, we want to invite people in to visit them. So how do you balance that push and pull of allowing people to see some of these great things, the Grand Canyon, the geysers of Yellowstone, arches, but without having impact by all the people that come there, via either through litter or housing to be close enough to stay there, or transportation in and out of these areas, or